The desert is not empty. It only looks that way at first glance. A vast and indifferent stretch of wind-swept sand where nothing seems capable of surviving for long. But beneath the surface, just a few feet of shifting grit, something far older is waiting. Stone foundations cut in precise lines, walls aligned with a geometry that does not belong to chance.
The desert
Deeper
guards
still,
its secrets
broken
well.
fragments of inscriptions that once carried the
Here,
authority of a power
the
so
faint
large it shaped
outlines of
entire
a
regions,
massive
now reduced to silence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The place has no single agreed name in modern records, not because it was insignificant, but because its memory fractures every time it appears. A reference in one ancient tablet is contradicted by another. A partial map survives in a ruined archive, but the labels have been scraped away. Even the neighbouring civilizations that once traded with it seem uncertain how to describe it. Some call it a kingdom, others an empire, and a few describe it in terms that blur into myth, as if they were no longer sure whether it had ever been fully real. And yet the physical traces refuse to disappear. The broken irrigation channel runs for miles beneath the sand, engineered with a precision that suggests large-scale coordination. Not a single settlement, but a network. Archaeologists who first mapped its remains expected a modest regional culture. What they found instead hinted at something far larger. Standardised building methods repeating across distant sites, consistent measurements in architecture separated by hundreds of kilometres, and ceramic styles that evolved too quickly and too uniformly to belong to isolated communities. At its height, this was not a marginal society struggling on the edges of civilization. It appears to have been a superpower in every sense that matters in the ancient world. It controlled water, trade, and movement across vast terrain. It influenced neighbouring cultures not only through conquest, but through systems that others adopted voluntarily, suggesting a level of technological or administrative sophistication that outpaced its contemporaries. And yet, when modern history tries to name it clearly, there is hesitation. Something about its record feels incomplete, as if large sections of its story were removed and lost. The question is not simply what it was. The deeper question is why so much of it is missing.
Best price
In the earliest layers of
It's
excavation,
lovely.
what stands out is not grandeur,
and a kilo
but
of
absence.
potatoes, please.
Entire urban districts appear to have been systematically dismantled. Foundations remain, but upper structures are gone. In some sites, burned layers suggest sudden destruction, while in others, there is no sign of violence at all, only abandonment followed by slow burial under natural sediment. The inconsistency is unsettling. It does not point to a single collapse event, but to multiple processes acting in different ways, almost as if the civilization's disappearance unfolded unevenly across time and space. Some of the most striking clues come not from ruins, but from what is not written. Ancient neighbouring records, which are often meticulous in documenting trade and war, mention this superpower only briefly. In earlier periods,
Look, right
it is
there on the
described
lid.
as dominant,
I see it.
organised, and
We have
expansive.
to be extremely
Later,
careful with this section.
Fades
This
from
is
mention almost
incredible.
abruptly. Then, in the historical record of those same neighbouring societies, references shift, trade routes are reattributed, cities once described as under its influence are suddenly recorded as independent or under control. The transition is too clean in some places, too sudden in others. Scholars still debate whether this reflects a true collapse or something more complex, the deliberate rewriting of history by successor states. One of the most puzzling aspects is how quickly memory of the civilization becomes unstable. Within a few generations, its identity is no longer clearly preserved. Instead, fragments of its name appear attached to unrelated myths, or are used to describe distant semi-legendary lands. It is as if the civilization did not simply fall, but became unanchored from reality itself. What survives in the record suggests a society
textile
deeply integrated
here,
across its territory.
nestled with the coins,
Standardized weights and
proves
measures
a
appear across
direct
excavation
cultural
sites.
exchange,
Administrative
not
seals
just
repeat
trade.
identical motifs. Even the layout of cities follows recurring patterns, implying a central authority or shared system of governance that extended far beyond a single city-state. This level of coordination usually leaves a strong historical footprint. Yet here, the footprint thins dramatically after a certain point in time. The desert winds do not preserve memory evenly. Some sites are sealed under layers of sediment, perfectly preserved like snapshots of a frozen moment. Others are stripped bare, as if intentionally exposed and erased. The contrast raises uncomfortable possibilities. Natural disaster alone rarely produces such selective preservation. Human intervention, on the other hand, often does. And so the story of this vanished superpower begins not with a clear downfall, but with a pattern of fragmentation. A power once large enough to organise landscapes across vast distances now survives only in broken references, partial ruins, and disputed interpretations. It is present everywhere in traces, yet absent in narrative coherence. Even its strongest remnants feel like echoes rather than evidence of continuity. A carved stone discovered at the edge of one excavation site carries a symbol, repeated across multiple regions. It is not language in the conventional sense, but a mark of authority or identity. The same symbol appears elsewhere, slightly altered, as if copied through generations without full understanding. Eventually, it disappears entirely from later cultural layers, replaced by unfamiliar scripts that show no clear lineage. This break in continuity is where the mystery deepens. Civilizations usually evolve visibly, even after collapse, and cultural and linguistic traces persist in modified forms. Here, however, there is a sharper discontinuity, as though something interrupted the transmission of knowledge itself. Whether that interruption came from catastrophe, migration, or deliberate suppression is still unknown. What is certain is that a superpower once existed here, one capable of shaping entire regions, and yet its memory has been reduced to fragments scattered across time. The dust does not just cover its ruins, it seems to have settled over its identity as well, leaving behind a civilization that is simultaneously present
The
and
decline
erased.
of the central city
And as the
stands
first layer
in
of this
stark
story emerges
contrast
from
to the
beneath the
vibrant
sand,
life found in the
it becomes
settlements,
clear that the
where
disappearance
ancient
was not a
traditions
single
are
moment.
carefully
It
preserved.
was a process, slow in some places, abrupt in others, and still not fully understood. Beneath the oldest surviving settlements linked to this forgotten superpower, something unexpected begins to emerge, not a linear beginning, but a layered confusion of origins. The deeper archaeologists dig, the less clear it becomes where the civilization actually
Look at the
starts.
detail on this glyph.
In most
It
ancient
confirms
cultures,
the dating.
early layers show simplicity, small
And the
villages growing
alignment
into
here
towns,
suggests
then into
it's
cities.
part of the main
Here,
observatory.
the pattern is already complex from the earliest identifiable phase. Large-scale planning appears almost fully formed, as if the civilization arrived with its infrastructure already in place. This is where the idea of an
intricate
empire without a clear
cuneiform
name
script
becomes
on
more
these
than a poetic
tablets
description.
provides
It becomes an
unprecedented insight
archaeological
into the
problem.
economic
In
life
the
of
lowest
the
excavation
period.
layers, there are sudden jumps in technological consistency. Irrigation systems appear already optimized for arid environments. Settlements are aligned with trade corridors that extend far beyond local geography. Even pottery styles, often used by archaeologists to track gradual cultural evolution, show surprisingly synchronized development across distant regions. Normally,
For centuries,
such
the
uniformity requires
civilization
centuries of
thrived on
slow
the
exchange.
monsoon.
Here,
But as
it
the
seems
rains
compressed,
shifted,
as if
their
multiple
world
regions
turned
adopted
to
shared
dust.
standards in an unusually short span of time. What makes this even more unusual is the absence of a clear founding narrative. Most early civilizations preserve at least some trace of origin stories, king lists, mythological ancestors, or early inscriptions describing the rise of authority. In this case, those early narratives are either missing or fragmented
While the
beyond
lowlands
reconstruction.
succumbed to drought,
Later cultures that
these
inherited
highland
fragments of the
communities
civilization's territory
thrived,
often attribute
thanks
its
to
origins to
sophisticated
vague
water
ancestral
management.
figures or semi-divine founders. But these accounts conflict with each other so heavily that they cannot be aligned into a single coherent history. Scholars still debate whether this gap reflects lost records or
Inca
deliberate
understood
erasure.
that control over
The evidence
water
remains
was
incomplete.
control over life itself.
One of the most revealing discoveries
These
comes from settlement
high-altitude canals
stratigraphy in a
transformed the
cluster of
very
sites along an
landscape.
ancient river system. Here, archaeologists expected to find gradual urban expansion. Instead, they found what looks like a sudden consolidation of multiple smaller communities into a single coordinated system. Villages that once operated independently begin to show synchronized architectural styles within a narrow time window. Storage facilities become standardized. Administrative spaces appear in previously informal settlements. It is as if an external organizing force rapidly restructured the entire region. Yet there is no sign of conquest in the traditional sense. Few destruction layers exist at the point of transition. No widespread burn horizons, no mass graves, no clear evidence of violent takeover. Instead, the transformation appears administrative rather than military. That distinction is important.
Look at how
because it
different
suggests
these
that
have
the
become
emergence of
from
this
the royal
superpower
standards.
may not have been driven solely by warfare.
This
by
lion
integration,
hunt is exquisite
persuasion,
work, however.
or systems of control that left minimal physical violence behind. This possibility shifts how the civilization is understood. Rather than a typical empire expanding through visible conquest, it may have operated through something closer to infrastructural absorption, bringing surrounding regions into its network, until political boundaries become secondary to economic and
These
administrative
massive
alignment.
structures, once
Evidence
symbols of
supporting this
state
idea
power,
appears in the
have
uniformity
been
of measurement
reclaimed
systems
by the people as
across multiple
bustling
excavation
residential
sites
hubs
separated
and
by
markets.
hundreds of kilometers.
Dig deeper there,
Identical
son.
units of weight
The flow
and
is
length
still
are
weak.
found.
I am
These systems
trying.
are too
The mud is
consistent to have
heavy.
developed
Bring
independently.
those stones
Even
quickly.
more striking, they persist across different material cultures, suggesting that local identities were preserved while being integrated into a larger framework of standardization. And yet, despite this apparent cohesion, the historical record refuses to clarify who initiated it. There is no singular capital identified with certainty. Several major urban centres compete for that role, each showing signs of administrative importance but none definitively dominant across all periods. It is possible that the civilization was not centralised in the way later empires were.
The journey from
Instead,
complex
operated as a
images to
distributed network of
abstract
power,
symbols
something
took
close to a coordinated
centuries,
system,
shaping
than a
how
traditional capital-based
civilization
state.
recorded its
If that is
history.
the case, it may explain why later historical
Easy
memory
now,
struggles to
easy.
define it clearly. Decentralised systems often leave fragmented records,
Lower away,
especially when they
steady.
collapse. Another layer of complexity emerges from linguistic evidence. The earliest inscriptions linked to this civilization do not form a fully understood language family. Instead, they appear as
Once a
clusters
symbol of
related symbol
strength,
systems,
these
some of
overgrown
which overlap
ruins now
geographically,
speak
while
only
others
of
appear
forgotten
isolated.
borders
Over time,
and the
these
relentless
scripts
march of
diverge rather
time.
than converge,
The wear patterns
suggesting
on
either
the
rapid
molars.
regional adaptation
The
or
isotopic
the breakdown
analysis
of a
from
shared
this
written
sample
standard.
clearly indicates
What is
migration,
particularly intriguing
perhaps
is that
from as
later
far
cultures
as North
sometimes
Africa.
repurpose these symbols, not to preserve their meaning, but as decorative or ritual elements. This shift often signals a loss of linguistic understanding within 1 or 2 generations.
50
When writing
dinar for
becomes
the
symbolic
silk.
rather than
Too
functional,
much, I offer
historical
30.
continuity begins to
Come
dissolve.
look at these spices.
At this point in
Best
the archaeological
market.
record, a pattern begins to form. The civilization appears highly organized, widely distributed, and technologically consistent, yet strangely unstable in its narrative continuity. It does not behave like a typical empire that rises from a singular
Now
origin and
arriving on
expands
platform
outward.
3,
Instead,
the express
it
service
behaves
from the
like something
capital.
that was assembled
Have your
quickly from
documents
multiple
ready for
pre-existing
inspection.
parts, or perhaps restructured
Once,
so thoroughly
this was
that its
a
early
vital
developmental
trade
stages
route,
were overwritten.
but the
One lesser-known
relentless
detail
desert has
reinforces
begun
this
to
impression.
claim it.
In several peripheral sites, researchers have found architectural anomaly structures that do not conform to the dominant building style of the civilization, but are still integrated into its urban fabric. These structures appear older than surrounding buildings, suggesting that the superpower absorbed pre-existing settlements rather than replacing them entirely. In some cases, these older
The
structures were
central
preserved and
authority waned.
repurposed rather
The
than
vital
demolished.
arteries of trade
This layered
flickered
construction
and
history
died,
complicates any
leaving
attempt to
only
define a single
fragmented
origin
clusters
point.
of civilization.
Instead of a clean rise, there is a patchwork of earlier cultures woven together under a later administrative system. What survives in the record suggests that this superpower was not born in isolation, but assembled across landscapes already inhabited by diverse societies. Whether through gradual integration or rapid consolidation, it achieved a level of coordination that outpaced its predecessors. And yet, the very complexity that made it powerful may also have made it vulnerable. Systems built from multiple layers of inherited structure often depend on delicate balances. When those balances shift, the entire framework can fracture in ways that are not immediately visible in the archaeological record. At this stage, however, there is no clear sign of collapse, only formation, only expansion, only the quiet emergence of something vast and structured, whose origins remain partially hidden even in its earliest surviving traces. The river no longer flows the way it once did. Its current has shifted over centuries, carving new paths through the land while abandoning old ones that now lie buried beneath silt and silence. Yet it is along these forgotten channels that the first clear image of this ancient superpower begins to take shape, not in palaces or monuments, but in infrastructure vast, coordinated, and designed with an understanding of landscape that feels uncomfortably modern in its precision. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What emerges from the soil is not a single city, but a system of cities. Settlements appear at measured intervals along waterways, connected by routes that suggest planned distribution rather than organic
Shovel
growth.
deeper there.
This spacing is too consistent to be accidental.
Heave it
It
over the
implies a
bank.
governing logic that treated geography not as a
We
barrier,
need more
but as a
baskets
network
now.
to be optimized. Agricultural terraces stretch outward from these settlements in controlled patterns, shaping the land itself into productive geometry. Canals divert seasonal floodwaters with engineered precision. In some regions, water management is so sophisticated that it appears to have stabilized entire ecosystems that would otherwise have been too dry or too unpredictable for large populations. This level of environmental control suggests something important about the civilization's foundation. It was not merely reacting to nature, it was actively restructuring it. And yet, what makes this landscape so compelling is not only its scale, but its uniformity. Across hundreds of kilometers, irrigation channels follow similar design principles. Gate systems repeat identical engineering solutions. Even the slope gradients of canals fall within remarkably
Each
narrow
layer
tolerances.
tells a story
Such
of conquest
consistency
and
implies shared
succession,
knowledge distributed
a physical
across vast
record of
distances,
regime
or a central
change,
authority capable of
stretching back
enforcing
3
technical standards
millennia.
across multiple regions. Either explanation points to a level of organisation that few ancient societies achieved. One of the most surprising discoveries comes from soil analysis in
The
abandoned
seal
agricultural
must be
zones.
perfect,
Layers
or
of
the
sediment
water
reveal
will find
cycles
its
of
own
intense
path.
cultivation followed by sudden cessation. In
I
some
will
areas,
remember that.
fields were used continuously for generations
While
before
the
they were
great
abruptly
cities
left to revert
crumble,
to marsh or desert.
life in the periphery
There is no gradual
endures,
decline in usage, just a
preserving the
sharp break in
traditions of a
agricultural
forgotten
continuity.
age amidst the
Scholars still
ruins
debate
of
what
empire.
caused these interruptions.
I cannot
The evidence
decipher
remains
this
incomplete.
section.
But several patterns appear
Copy it
repeatedly.
precisely
In
as
some
you see it.
locations, water
The
tables
meaning
dropped
is
unexpectedly,
obscured to us.
making irrigation systems ineffective. In others, channels were deliberately blocked or rerouted. And in a few rare cases, there are signs that maintenance simply stopped entirely, as if the systems were abandoned while still functional. What is especially intriguing is that these disruptions do not occur uniformly across the civilization's territory. Some regions show sustained agricultural activity long after others have declined. This uneven pattern complicates any single cause explanation. If environmental collapse was responsible, it did not strike everywhere at once. If political fragmentation caused it, the breakdown was uneven and asynchronous. Trade networks provide another layer of insight. Goods move along predictable corridors, linking inland production centres with coastal distribution hubs. Archaeological finds show standardised containers used to transport grain, oils, and crafted goods. These containers appear
Look at
across multiple
this.
sites,
It's
suggesting a
perfectly
regulated economic
preserved.
system that extended
This
beyond local
confirms the
exchange.
standardization
However,
they used across
at a
the
certain point in the
empire.
record, this network begins to fracture. Distribution becomes localised. Long-distance goods decrease in frequency. Regional styles of production reassert themselves.
Above
The
the
once
arid
unified
ruins of
system
the
begins to
past,
splinter
these
into
communities
isolated pockets of
endured.
activity.
Stable
This
rainfall
transition is
ensured
not
their
accompanied by
survival,
clear
while the great
evidence of
cities
warfare or
below
invasion.
slowly turned to
Instead,
dust.
it resembles a gradual loosening of connections, as if the mechanisms that once held the system together are losing coherence. One particularly revealing site shows warehouses filled with goods that were never distributed.
The
Storage rooms
administrative
remain
seals
intact,
of the ancients
sealed
were
and
intricate,
organised.
symbols
Their contents
of
were never moved
centralized
onward.
power.
It is as if logistical systems stopped functioning mid-process, leaving supply chains frozen in place. In another region, transport roads show signs of continued use long after administrative control appears to have weakened. Merchants or local groups may have maintained portions of the system independently, but without centralised coordination, efficiency would have declined quickly. The infrastructure itself becomes a kind of archaeological testimony. Roads, canals, and storage complexes do not simply vanish. They persist, even when the society that built them no longer operates them effectively. And in that persistence, a strange contradiction emerges. The physical world of the civilization remains intact long after its organisational structure begins to fail. Among the more subtle clues are changes in construction quality. Early phases of urban development show consistent craftsmanship and standardised materials. Later layers reveal increasing variation. Stonework becomes less precise. Brick alignment loses uniformity. Repairs are made with whatever materials are available rather than following original specifications. This degradation suggests not only resource scarcity, but also the breakdown of skilled labour systems. Training networks that once maintained technical knowledge may have weakened, leading to gradual loss of institutional memory. A lesser-known detail adds
2
further
baskets
complexity.
for the grain, as
In
agreed.
several sites, archaeologists have found unfinished construction
Catch
projects
looks
frozen
good
in
today,
time.
old man.
Walls half built, foundations laid but never completed. Tools left in place as if workers simply stopped and did not return. There is no clear evidence of catastrophic interruption, no widespread fire layers or destruction horizons. Instead, it appears that construction activity halted in stages, possibly as labour forces were redirected or as priorities shifted under stress. What begins to emerge is not a sudden collapse, but a slow unravelling of coordination. At its height, this superpower appears to have functioned as a deeply integrated system, one that managed water, agriculture, trade, and construction across vast distances. But systems of this scale depend on continuous alignment between multiple regions. When that alignment weakens, even slightly, the effects propagate unevenly, creating pockets of stability and instability that do not follow simple geographic logic. This unevenness may explain why the civilization is so difficult to reconstruct in historical memory. Different regions experience different timelines of decline, meaning there was no single moment when the system ended. Instead, there were multiple endings, layered across space and time, and in that fragmentation, the civilization begins to disappear not as a dramatic collapse, but as a fading coherence, one that leaves behind functioning pieces without the structure that once unified them.
I
The land
cannot
still remembers
spare
the
more
shape
than
of the
this
system.
sack of oats.
The system
The
itself
blue
is
dye
gone.
is costly, but
The
all
first
right, hand
inscription
it over.
derived not as clarity,
fine weave,
but as
sir.
distortion. The broken
Look at
slab
the
pulled
clear
from a collapsed
delineation
foundation
here.
shows
The early
rows of
phase
symbols
was
that should,
highly
in
centralized.
theory,
Yeah.
explain
And then
everything
it just
names,
breaks down
events,
into these ad hoc
laws,
structures.
structure of authority.
More mud for the
Instead,
wall.
they resist
The
interpretation.
water is
The
rising.
language is partially recognisable but never fully
Hurry!
stable.
The fields
Characters repeat
depend
with
on
slight
us.
variations, as if copied across generations without complete understanding, meaning slips between the cracks of the script itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, this is where the mystery of the lost writing systems becomes central to the disappearance of the superpower. Writing is usually
As
one of
the
the most
central
durable
authority
traces
waned,
civilization leaves
the vast
behind.
network fractured.
Even after political collapse,
The age of
language tends
superpowers
to
was
survive
over,
in adaptive
replaced
forms.
by isolated
But here,
regional nodes.
something different appears to have happened. The written system does not simply evolve at fragments. In early layers, inscriptions are consistent and widely distributed. Administrative
Make sure
records,
that line is
trade
exactly
logs, and official
perpendicular to the
decrees
main
follow standardized
baseline.
formats.
We need precision
This
here.
suggests a highly
I have the
organized
coordinates for the
bureaucratic
next
system
stake right here,
capable
Professor.
of maintaining order across distance. Yet in later layers, the same script becomes increasingly inconsistent. Regional variations multiply rapidly. Some symbols are simplified beyond recognition, while others become ornamental rather than functional. And then, in many regions, writing disappears entirely from everyday use. This is not a gradual replacement by
The
another language
stratigraphy
family,
here
at
is
least not in the
remarkable,
archaeological record we
showing
currently
how
have.
the settlement was
Instead,
rebuilt
there is a
time
break
and
of
again
discontinuity
over
where writing
hundreds of
vanishes and
years.
later reappears in different forms,
From the
often
earliest
associated
animal
with
motifs
successor
to the
cultures that no
grandeur
longer
of
fully
the
understand
Akkadian
the original
kings,
system.
these seals
Scholars still
trace the
debate whether
very
this reflects
concept
loss
of
of
authority
literacy,
through the
cultural
ages.
rejection,
The
or deliberate
uniformity is
suppression.
astonishing.
The evidence
Have you ever
remains
seen
incomplete.
anything like it?
One of the
Never.
most striking examples
It's
comes from a
perfectly
storage
aligned
archive
with the
discovered near what was
solstice
once a
markers.
major administrative centre.
Here,
The
the
archive
relentless
contains
currents of the
thousands of clay
delta
tablets,
reshaped the land,
carefully organised,
slowly consuming
many
the
still
remnants
sealed in
of
their
those
original
who once
containers.
called this
But only a
unforgiving
fraction of them can be
landscape
translated
home.
with confidence. The rest resist classification, not because the script is unknown, but because the syntax appears to shift unpredictably across time and region. It is as if multiple administrative traditions were merging and diverging simultaneously within the same system. This complexity suggests that the superpower may not have had a single unified writing tradition, but rather a network of overlapping literate systems. Such a structure could function efficiently during stability, but become vulnerable when coordination weakens. Once central authority declined, regional scribal traditions may have diverged too quickly to maintain mutual intelligibility. In several excavation sites, archaeologists have found evidence of erasure on inscriptions. Earlier texts are partially scraped away and replaced with new markings. In some cases, entire names of rulers or officials
According to the
appear to have been
overlay, this
deliberately
section
removed.
is much older than the
This practice
northern
is not unusual
route.
in ancient
Look at
politics.
the
Successor
ceramic
regimes often
fragments
rewrite
here.
history to
It
legitimize
confirms
themselves.
the dating.
But the scale here is unusual. Erasure appears systematic, not isolated. Some inscriptions are not merely altered, but overwritten multiple times, creating dense palimpsests of administrative memory. What was once a clear record becomes layered confusion, where earlier meaning is still faintly visible beneath later revisions. This suggests not only political change, but repeated attempts to redefine historical narrative itself. Another unexpected detail emerges from peripheral regions. Here, writing appears to have survived longer in informal context than in official administration. Marks on pottery, trade seals, and even household objects show simplified versions of the script continuing after formal inscriptions disappear. This pattern implies that literacy did not vanish uniformly. Instead, it may have decayed unevenly, preserved
This
in daily life
changes
while disappearing from
everything we thought
institutional
we knew
systems.
about the region.
At the same time,
We're
neighbouring
looking at a
civilizations begin to
civilization
shift how
lost
they
to the
reference this
sands for
superpower in their own
millennia.
records. Early references describe structured diplomacy and trade agreements. Later references become vague, sometimes mythologized, sometimes contradictory. Names of rulers are replaced with titles that resemble epithets rather than proper identifiers. Over time, the civilization becomes less of a political entity in foreign records and more of a symbolic reference point. This transformation in external memory is crucial. It suggests that the disappearance of the superpower was not only physical, but also epistemic.
Centuries of wind and water have carved away the cliff,
One of the most
exposing
intriguing
the
artifacts tied
remains
to
of
this
what
period
was once
is a
a
fragmented
thriving
list of
port.
commodities found in a coastal settlement. The list includes goods that were clearly imported from inland regions associated with the superpower, but the final entries are incomplete. The tablet ends mid-record, as if the system that produced it stopped functioning while documentation was still in progress. There is no follow-up archive from the same administrative context. In another case, seal impressions used for official verification show a sudden shift in design. Early seals are complex, standardized, and widely distributed. Later seals become
Hidden
simpler,
for centuries,
more localized,
these
and sometimes
geometric
crudely
patterns
imitated.
confirm the
This
existence
degradation
of
in
a
administrative
vast,
authentication suggests a
abandoned
breakdown in
settlement
trust networks.
swallowed by the desert.
Without reliable verification
Look at the
systems,
sharp transition
large-scale
here. That
coordination becomes
corresponds
increasingly
exactly
difficult
to the
maintain.
major drought event.
What
Yes,
emerges
the
from all
sediment
this is a slow
composition
erosion of
changes
informational
drastically
cohesion.
right at this
The
depth.
civilization does not simply lose territory or resources, it loses shared understanding. Communication systems fragment, administrative language diverges, written records become inconsistent, and eventually, writing itself loses its function as a binding force across the system. Yet even in this fragmentation, traces remain. Certain symbols persist across regions long after their meaning is lost. They appear on amulets, building corners, and ceremonial objects, no longer functioning as language but as inherited
Across
design.
this ancient
These
map,
remnants suggest
we
that
see the
cultural memory
definitive
outlived
paths
functional
of
literacy,
human migration,
preserving fragments of
reconstructed
identity
through
even after meaning
centuries of
dissolved.
archaeological
And
data.
so the written record becomes both the clearest evidence of the civilization's complexity and one of the clearest signs of its unraveling. What once unified vast territories through standardized communication ultimately dissolves into competing fragments of interpretation. The silence that follows is not immediate, it is gradual, uneven, and scattered across time. And in that silence, history begins to forget how to read what remains. The silence in the record is not a clean break. It arrives slowly, like dust settling over an abandoned city where life once continued just long enough for memory to blur at the edges. In some regions, inscriptions continue for generations after the administrative system that produced them has already weakened. In others, writing stops abruptly, leaving only empty spaces where records should have been. The result is not a single moment of disappearance, but a widening gap between what was once documented and what is no longer recorded at all. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe.
The strontium
If
levels
this is the
here
kind of
match the
history and mystery
migration
you
patterns
enjoy,
we hypothesized.
this is where the
and
idea
the
of this
oxygen
sudden silence
isotopes
in
in the
records becomes
pottery
more
align
complicated
perfectly
than it
with
first
the
appears.
coastal region.
To later
Here,
historians,
the layers of
absence
history
looks
are
abrupt,
visible.
as if the
Roman
superpower
arches
vanished
support
overnight.
Byzantine walls,
But
a
archaeological
testament
layers
to the
suggest a
city's
more uneven
enduring
reality.
legacy through the
In
ages.
some cities, administrative activity continues while neighbouring regions are
As
already
the wind
in decline.
blows, the
In
faint
others,
outlines
foreign trade
emerge,
persists even after internal
hinting at a
government structures appear
sophisticated
weakened.
settlement.
The
Look
timeline
closely
fractures
here.
into
This
overlapping
darker
declines rather
soil
than a
indicates
single
the
collapse
original
event.
cultivation
One of
level.
the most important
I see
clues
it.
comes from how external
carbon dating
civilizations respond to
confirms
this
the
fading
period.
presence. Neighbouring states, which once recorded detailed interactions, tribute exchanges, military alliances, trade negotiations, begin to reduce the superpower to vague references. At first, it is still named, still described as a structured entity, but over time, its identity becomes unstable in foreign records. It is referred to differently across regions, sometimes as a kingdom, sometimes as a land, sometimes simply as a directional boundary marker rather than a political state. This shift suggests that the disappearance was not only physical but also diplomatic. As the internal structure weakened, external recognition of its coherence also eroded.
Incredible.
The archaeological layers
The
that correspond to this
stratification
transitional
confirms
period,
it was
material
repurposed
evidence shows a
centuries
similar
later.
pattern of fragmentation.
Look at the detail
Urban
here.
centres no longer display synchronised development. Some districts maintain high levels of activity, while others decline rapidly. Public buildings are repurposed. Administrative spaces become residential or storage areas. The spatial logic of the city begins
What
to
was
dissolve.
once a sprawling
One particularly
network
revealing site shows a
connecting
central
the great
administrative
cities
complex
of the
gradually
ancient
transformed
world
into a
is
mixed-use
now
structure
lit-
over several generations. Rooms once dedicated to record-keeping are repurposed into workshops, seal storage areas are abandoned, corridors that once managed bureaucratic flow become blocked or subdivided. The architecture itself becomes a record of institutional decay. What makes this especially significant is the absence of destruction layers. There is no evidence of a catastrophic event that suddenly rendered the complex unusable. Instead, changes occur incrementally, suggesting that administrative authority eroded faster than physical infrastructure. In rural regions, the pattern differs again. Agricultural systems continue functioning long after urban centres begin to decline. Fields are still cultivated, irrigation channels still operate, but maintenance becomes inconsistent. Repairs are delayed. Smaller communities take over responsibilities once managed centrally. This indicates a shift from coordinated control to localised adaptation. Scholars still debate what drove this uneven transition. The evidence remains incomplete, but several possibilities emerge from the material record. One hypothesis suggests that administrative fragmentation began at the regional level, weakening coordination before affecting production systems. Another proposes that environmental or economic stress reduced the capacity for central governance to enforce standards. A third considers the possibility of overlapping crises, each reinforcing the others in different regions at different times. What's clear is that no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Trade networks provide another crucial layer of insight. During the height of the superpower's influence, goods moved through tightly regulated corridors. Standardized containers and seals ensured that products could be tracked across vast distances. But in the transitional period, these systems begin to fail. Containers are reused without standard markings. Seals are copied or abandoned. Long-distance trade becomes sporadic rather than systematic. Interestingly, some trade does not stop entirely. Instead, it becomes more localized and opportunistic. Coastal hubs continue to exchange goods with nearby regions, but long-distance inland connections weaken significantly. This suggests that the infrastructure of exchange did not collapse all at once, but rather unraveled from the center outward. One of the most telling discoveries comes from warehouse sites near former distribution centers. In several cases, large quantities of goods remain stored in organized patterns, never fully distributed. Some containers are still sealed, others show signs of partial access, as if operations stopped mid-cycle. There is no evidence of looting or sudden abandonment in many of these sites, which raises the possibility that logistical systems failed while physical security remained intact. This creates a strange contradiction: functioning infrastructure without functioning administration. The machinery of the civilization continues to exist, even after the organizational logic that directed it begins to fail. In urban contexts, the decline is visible in smaller but equally important details. Maintenance of public works becomes irregular. Roads develop uneven surfaces that are patched rather than properly reconstructed. Water management systems show signs of reduced oversight, with some channels silting while others are overused. These gradual inefficiencies accumulate, slowly reducing the resilience of entire urban networks. A lesser-known detail adds further depth to this picture. In some cities, archaeologists have found evidence of pause phases in construction activity. Projects appear to have been halted intentionally, not destroyed. Building materials are left in place. Foundations remain exposed for extended periods before being repurposed or buried. These pauses suggest moments when labour and resources were redirected, possibly due to shifting priorities or reduced central coordination. Over time, these interruptions become more frequent. Construction slows, expansion stops, maintenance replaces development, and eventually, even maintenance becomes inconsistent. What emerges is a system losing its ability to renew itself. And yet, even as coherence fades, remnants of structure persist. Certain regions maintain stable administration longer than others. Some trade routes continue functioning in reduced form. Cultural practices survive in localized pockets. The civilization does not vanish uniformly, it fragments into uneven survivals, each carrying a partial memory of the larger whole. The most important realization at this stage is that disappearance is not always an event. Sometimes it is a process of disconnection, where parts of a system continue to exist long after the system itself has stopped functioning as a unified entity. And in that gradual disconnection, the superpower begins to fade not from existence, but from coordination. What remains is scattered, incomplete, and increasingly difficult to recognize as a single civilization at all. The soil holds a memory that written records cannot. In the dry river basins and abandoned terraces once governed by the forgotten superpower, layers of sediment preserve a timeline that contradicts the idea of a simple collapse. There is no single horizon of destruction, no universal ash layer marking a final catastrophe. Instead, there are shifts subtle at first, then increasingly disruptive, etched into pollen counts, mineral deposits, and changing soil chemistry. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the environmental record begins to show stress long before the civilization's administrative systems fully unravel. In some regions, drought cycles become more frequent. In others, rainfall patterns shift unpredictably. Lake levels fluctuate in ways that suggest longer-term climatic instability rather than short seasonal variation. These changes do not destroy the civilization outright, but they begin to strain its most critical foundation, water management. For a society that built its power on irrigation and controlled agriculture, even small disruptions to hydrological stability would have carried significant consequences. Canals designed for predictable seasonal flow suddenly face variability. Reservoirs that once supported entire urban networks become unreliable. Fields that depended on carefully timed flooding begin to fail intermittently. Yet the impact is uneven. Some regions adapt successfully, modifying infrastructure or shifting cultivation strategies. Others decline more rapidly, suggesting that resilience was not evenly distributed across the superpower's territory. This uneven environmental stress aligns closely with the fragmentation seen in administrative and trade systems. What emerges is not a single environmental collapse, but a patchwork of localized crises unfolding over centuries. One of the most significant discoveries comes from sediment cores extracted near former agricultural zones. These cores show alternating layers of high productivity and abandonment. Pollen from cultivated crops appears, disappears, and reappears in cycles that do not always correspond across regions. This suggests that agricultural systems were repeatedly disrupted, but not necessarily destroyed in a single event. Scholars still debate the cause of these disruptions. The evidence remains incomplete, but climate variability is a strong candidate. Shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns could have altered rainfall distribution across the civilization's core regions, creating instability in a system that depended on consistency. At the same time, there are signs that human activity may have amplified environmental stress. Deforestation for construction and fuel, expansion of irrigation networks, and intensive agriculture could have altered local ecosystems, reducing resilience during periods of climatic fluctuation. In some regions, soil salinization appears in later layers, indicating that irrigation practices may have gradually degraded land productivity. The interaction between environmental change and human systems is where the story becomes more complex. Neither factor alone fully explains the patterns observed in the archaeological record. Instead, they appear to reinforce each other in feedback loops. Environmental stress weakens agricultural output, which strains administrative capacity, which in turn reduces the ability to maintain infrastructure that stabilizes the environment. One of the most revealing examples of this feedback appears in abandoned canal systems. In early phases, these canals are carefully maintained, with regular dredging and repair. In later phases, maintenance becomes sporadic. Sediment accumulates, water flow becomes uneven. Eventually, entire sections are bypassed or left to silt over completely. Once this happens, surrounding fields lose access to reliable irrigation, accelerating local decline. Interestingly, these failures do not always occur simultaneously. Some canal systems remain functional long after others have collapsed. This suggests that regional governance structures continue to operate independently, even as central coordination weakened. In highland areas, where rainfall is more reliable, settlements show greater continuity. In lowland river basins, where agriculture depends heavily on managed water systems, decline is more pronounced. This geographic disparity reinforces the idea that environmental vulnerability was not uniform, but deeply tied to infrastructure dependence. Another lesser-known detail emerges from analysis of ancient lake beds. In certain regions, there is evidence of sudden changes in water composition, including shifts in salinity and mineral content. These changes suggest either significant climatic shifts or alterations in inflow patterns, possibly due to upstream water diversion or canal failures. In either case, aquatic ecosystems would have been disrupted, affecting fishing economies and secondary food sources. The human response to these changes is visible in settlement patterns. Populations begin to relocate closer to more stable water sources. Smaller satellite communities form around surviving irrigation hubs. Urban centres shrink, not necessarily through abandonment, but through gradual redistribution of population density. This creates a different kind of decline, one that is spatial rather than absolute. The civilization does not vanish from the landscape, it disperses across it. In some areas, evidence suggests attempts at large-scale adaptation. New canals are constructed at different elevations. Reservoirs are expanded or reconfigured. Agricultural zones are shifted toward more reliable terrain. These efforts indicate that the civilization retained engineering capacity even during periods of stress. However, the scale of adaptation appears insufficient to fully counteract the broader environmental instability. What remains uncertain is whether these environmental pressures were the primary driver of decline, or simply one layer among many interacting stresses. Some regions show strong environmental correlation with collapse, while others do not follow the same pattern. This inconsistency is crucial. It suggests that environmental change alone cannot fully account for the disappearance of the superpower. Instead, what emerges is a more fragmented picture, a civilization gradually pushed into instability by shifting environmental conditions, but also weakened by internal fragmentation, administrative breakdown, and loss of coordination. The land records all of it without judgment. Layers of soil preserve both adaptation and failure side by side, showing where systems were maintained and where they quietly gave way. And in those layered sediments, the civilization's story becomes less about sudden disappearance, and more about endurance under increasing strain, a slow compression of stability until the structure can no longer hold together uniformly. What survives is not collapse, but uneven survival under pressure. At the edges of the superpower's former reach, something shifts in the archaeological record that cannot be explained by climate or infrastructure alone. Entire settlement layers begin to show abrupt changes in population composition. New pottery styles appear almost overnight in stratigraphic terms. Burial practices shift. Even dietary signatures and human remains begin to diverge sharply from earlier patterns. These are the signs of movement, large-scale human migration pressing into regions once tightly controlled by a centralized system. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. These migrations are not recorded as a single wave. They appear in pulses, uneven and regionally distinct. In some areas, new groups arrive and integrate gradually, adopting local systems while introducing their own material culture. In others, settlement disruption is more pronounced, with older occupation layers ending abruptly and being replaced by entirely different cultural assemblages. The variability makes it difficult to describe this as a single invasion or displacement event. What's clearer is that the superpowers' borders were becoming increasingly porous. One of the most significant patterns comes from frontier fortifications. Early defensive structures suggest a well-coordinated system of boundary control, with standardized construction methods and strategic placement along key routes. But in later phases, these fortifications show signs of neglect. Repairs are inconsistent. Some walls are reinforced while nearby sections deteriorate. In certain cases, fortifications are repurposed as domestic structures or storage facilities, indicating that their original defensive function had diminished. This weakening of border integrity coincides with increased evidence of cultural mixing in peripheral regions. Burial sites contain mixed assemblages of artifacts, suggesting communities where different traditions coexisted. While this could indicate peaceful integration, it may also reflect periods of instability where population groups were forced into proximity under changing political conditions. Scholars still debate the nature of these migrations. The evidence remains incomplete, and interpretations vary widely depending on regional datasets. Some propose climate-driven displacement from neighbouring regions experiencing drought or resource scarcity. Others suggest cascading instability triggered by the weakening of the superpower itself, creating power vacuums that encouraged movement into formerly controlled territories. What is consistent across multiple sites is the timing. These migratory patterns intensify during the same broad period when internal administrative systems show signs of fragmentation. This overlap raises the possibility that external pressure and internal decline were not separate processes, but interconnected forces. As populations moved into or through the superpower's territory, the existing administrative system struggled to maintain coherence. Resource distribution becomes uneven. Some regions show evidence of increased population density, while others experience sharp decline. Urban centres closest to migration corridors appear to have been under the most stress, both socially and economically. One particularly revealing site along an ancient trade corridor shows layers of rapid cultural transition. Earlier occupation levels are characterised by standardised architecture and centralised storage systems. Later levels contain mixed building styles, improvised construction techniques, and fragmented administrative artifacts. The transition is not violent in a clear archaeological sense, but it is undeniably disruptive. In this context, the idea of pressure from external migrations becomes more than a demographic phenomenon. It becomes a destabilizing force acting on already weakened systems. Even if these incoming groups were not inherently hostile, their movement through a region with declining administrative cohesion would have intensified existing vulnerabilities. Another important detail emerges from isotopic analysis of human remains in frontier zones. Individuals buried in later periods show more diverse geographic signatures than earlier populations, suggesting increased mobility and interaction across wider regions. This supports the idea that traditional settlement boundaries were breaking down, replaced by more fluid patterns of movement. At the same time, material culture becomes less standardized. Tools, ceramics, and ornaments vary significantly between neighboring communities. The uniformity that once defined the superpower's systems begins to dissolve, replaced by localized adaptation. This decentralization of material culture is often a sign of weakened central authority, but it can also reflect adaptive resilience under changing conditions. Both interpretations may be partially correct. In some regions, evidence suggests that incoming groups adopted elements of the superpower's infrastructure, maintaining canals, roads, and agricultural systems where possible. In others, these systems were abandoned or repurposed. The result is a fragmented landscape where continuity and disruption coexist unevenly. One of the more subtle but important findings comes from linguistic traces embedded in later cultural layers. Certain loanwords and symbolic motifs from the superpower persist in successor cultures, even when broader administrative systems have disappeared. This indicates not only migration, but cultural transmission that outlived political structures. However, these traces are inconsistent and often degraded. They appear more like echoes than direct continuations of tradition. What emerges from all this is a picture of a region in motion. Populations shifting, borders dissolving, systems adapting unevenly to new pressures. The superpower is no longer a fixed entity controlling space. It is becoming a landscape through which people move, negotiate, and reorganize their lives, and in that movement, the coherence of the old system continues to weaken. It is not simply that outsiders arrive, it is that the structure they encounter is already unable to fully define itself. In the layers that follow the period of migration pressure, something quieter begins to appear in the record, yet no less significant. The signs are no longer about who is arriving or how populations are moving. Instead, they point inward, toward the weakening structure of authority itself. Administrative seals lose consistency. Regional centres begin issuing conflicting directives. The once coordinated system that tied distant cities together starts to behave like a set of loosely connected fragments rather than a unified governing body. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first, the breakdown is subtle. Official inscriptions still exist, but their authority is uneven. A decree issued in one centre is not always acknowledged in another. Tax records become irregular. Storage systems that once followed standardised accounting methods begin to vary by region. The appearance of order remains, but its underlying consistency is fading. This is where the internal breakdown of authority becomes visible not as a single collapse, but as a progressive loss of coordination across multiple layers of governance. One of the most revealing indicators comes from administrative architecture. In earlier phases, governing structures are clearly defined central archives, standardised bureaucratic complexes, and regional offices aligned with shared protocols. In later phases, these buildings are modified in ways that suggest functional repurposing. Archive rooms become storage spaces for unrelated goods. Administrative courtyards are divided into smaller, semi-independent units. In some cases, official buildings are abandoned entirely while nearby informal structures take over their function. This physical transformation reflects something deeper than architectural change. It signals that the institutional system no longer operates as a unified hierarchy. Inscriptions from this period show increasing variation in titles and authority markers. Officials who once held clearly defined roles begin to adopt overlapping or ambiguous titles. In some regions, multiple individuals claim similar administrative authority, suggesting either fragmentation of central appointment systems or a breakdown in recognition of legitimacy. Scholars still debate whether this reflects political decentralization or institutional collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is consistent authority becomes local before it disappears entirely. Another important clue comes from record keeping itself. Earlier archives are meticulously organized, often stored in standardized containers with clear categorization systems. In later layers, records are found scattered, incomplete, or repurposed. Some documents are reused for unrelated purposes, such as construction material or packaging. This suggests not only administrative disruption, but a declining perception of the value of record preservation. When societies begin to discard their own records, it often indicates a loss of continuity in governance or identity. At the same time, some regions show attempts to preserve structure. Local administrations continue operating, sometimes maintaining versions of earlier systems. These localized governance models appear to function independently, suggesting that central authority did not vanish instantly, but fragmented into regional centers of power. This fragmentation creates a patchwork political landscape. Some cities maintain relative stability, while others descend into disorganization. Trade continues in limited form, but coordination across regions becomes unreliable. The superpower, once defined by its ability to integrate vast territories under shared systems, now exists as disconnected pockets of governance. One particularly striking site reveals overlapping administrative layers within the same urban space. Different seals and directives are found in the same building, sometimes contradicting each other chronologically. This suggests rapid turnover of authority or competing factions attempting to assert control over the same infrastructure. In such conditions, governance becomes less about long-term planning and more about immediate control of resources and space. The weakening of authority also affects infrastructure maintenance. Public works that once required coordinated labour across regions now depend on local initiative. Some canals and roads remain functional due to community-level maintenance, while others deteriorate rapidly. The inconsistency of upkeep further accelerates fragmentation, as regions become increasingly self-reliant. Another lesser-known detail comes from storage sites that show signs of redistribution rather than centralised management. Goods once stored for large-scale distribution are found divided into smaller caches, suggesting that centralised logistics systems were broken into local networks. This redistribution may have been adaptive, allowing survival under new conditions, but it also marks the end of unified economic coordination. In burial sites from this period, there is also a noticeable shift in social indicators. Wealth distribution becomes more localised. Some communities maintain high-status burials with imported goods, while nearby regions show more modest interments. This unevenness reflects growing regional disparities within the former superpower's territory. What is particularly important is that none of these changes point to a single catastrophic moment. Instead, they reveal a gradual erosion of institutional coherence, where different parts of the system fail at different times and in different ways. The superpower does not fall. It dissolves into layers of partial authority, and as those layers separate, the concept of a unified political entity becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, even in historical reconstruction. What remains is not a government, but a memory of governance distributed unevenly across broken systems. The trade roads tell a different kind of collapse story, one written not in inscriptions or decrees, but in dust, ruts, and abandoned waypoints stretching across once coordinated landscapes. These routes were the veins of the superpower, carrying grain, oil, stone, textiles, and administrative goods between regions that depended on one another to function as a unified system. When those veins begin to fail, the consequences ripple outward faster than political structures can respond. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At their peak, these trade networks were remarkably standardized. Road widths remain consistent across vast distances. Way stations appear at regular intervals, often with storage facilities, repair areas, and administrative checkpoints. Even the design of transport containers suggests regulation of similar shapes, capacities, and sealing methods are found across multiple regions, indicating a shared economic language. This level of coordination implies not just commerce, but oversight and authority capable of enforcing uniformity across wide geography. Yet in later layers, this uniformity begins to break apart. Road surfaces become uneven and poorly maintained. Way stations show signs of irregular use. Some are abandoned entirely, while others are repurposed for local needs. The once clear rhythm of long-distance exchange becomes fragmented into shorter, localized routes. Traders still move goods, but within reduced networks that no longer span the full extent of the former system. One of the most telling changes is in container distribution. Standardized storage vessels gradually disappear from the archaeological record and are replaced by regionally distinct variants. These local containers are often less efficient, suggesting that the shared standards that once enabled large-scale trade coordination were no longer being enforced or no longer understood. Scholars still debate whether this reflects institutional breakdown or economic decentralization. The evidence remains incomplete, but the timing aligns closely with administrative fragmentation seen in earlier layers. In some regions, trade does not disappear entirely. Instead, it shifts toward coastal hubs and river junctions where movement is easier to maintain. These nodes become increasingly important, functioning as independent centers of exchange rather than integrated parts of a larger system. The superpower's economy, once unified, begins to reorganize into semi-independent regional markets. This shift is visible in commodity distribution patterns. Goods that once traveled long distances now appear concentrated near production zones. Luxury items become rarer in inland regions but persist in coastal settlements. This suggests that long-distance redistribution networks were no longer functioning at scale. One particularly revealing discovery comes from a major inland storage complex. Archaeologists found thousands of sealed containers arranged in orderly rows, suggesting preparation for distribution that never occurred. The site shows no evidence of destruction or emergency evacuation. Instead, it appears that logistical operations simply stopped. Goods remained stored until they decayed or were buried by natural sediment. This frozen logistics phenomenon appears in multiple sites across the former superpower's territory. It suggests a systemic failure in coordination rather than localized disruption. The infrastructure existed, the goods were present, but the organizational mechanism required to move them had ceased functioning. Roadside settlements along major trade corridors show a similar pattern. Early layers indicate busy commercial activity, with workshops, inns, and administrative offices supporting long-distance travel. Later layers show reduced activity, followed by abandonment or conversion into agricultural or residential use. These settlements did not necessarily die suddenly, they were gradually bypassed as trade routes contracted. Another lesser-known detail comes from repair records found in fragmented inscriptions along former road networks. These records show increasing gaps between maintenance cycles. Early entries are frequent and systematic. Later entries become sporadic, then disappear entirely. Maintenance itself becomes localized, suggesting that central funding or coordination for infrastructure upkeep had ceased. In the absence of centralized oversight, road networks begin to reflect natural geography more than engineered planning. Travelers adapt to usable segments rather than following standardized routes. This creates a fragmented mobility system, where movement is still possible but no longer predictable at scale. In coastal regions, maritime trade persists longer than inland routes. Ships continue to connect certain hubs, maintaining partial continuity of exchange. However, even these networks show signs of simplification. Port records indicate fewer long-distance voyages and more regional exchange patterns. The maritime system, like the land-based one, contracts rather than collapses abruptly. This gradual contraction has an important implication. The superpower's economic system did not fail in a single synchronized event. Instead, it unraveled unevenly, with different sectors losing coherence at different times. In some areas, local economies adapt successfully, forming smaller but stable regional systems. In others, economic activity declines sharply, leading to depopulation or relocation. The overall picture is one of fragmentation rather than extinction. What makes this phase particularly significant is that economic systems often outlast political ones. Even after administrative authority weakens, trade can continue through informal networks. But here, even those informal systems appear to struggle to maintain long-distance cohesion. The superpower's strength was not just in production or resources, but in coordination. Once coordination fails, scale itself becomes difficult to sustain. And so the trade networks, once the most visible expression of unity, become one of the clearest indicators of fragmentation. They do not vanish, they shrink, bend, and split, until they no longer resemble a single system at all. What remains is movement without structure, exchange without integration, and connection without coherence. In the aftermath of fractured trade and weakening administration, something more subtle begins to surface in the archaeological record. It is not a structure, not a road, not even a settlement pattern. It is language itself no longer stable, no longer shared, and increasingly no longer understood. The mystery of the lost writing systems becomes most visible here, where symbols once used to coordinate a vast civilization begin to drift away from meaning entirely. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first, the shift is almost invisible. Inscriptions still appear in familiar formats, carved into stone, pressed into clay, or stamped onto seals. But the consistency that once defined them begins to erode. Symbols are rearranged in unusual sequences. Administrative phrasing becomes abbreviated or inconsistent. Entire sections of texts appear to follow different internal rules within the same document. This is not the emergence of a new language, but the fragmentation of an old one. In earlier periods, the superpower's written system functioned as a binding force across vast distances. It allowed trade, governance, and legal structures to remain coherent even between culturally diverse regions. But as administrative coordination weakens, so too does the standardization that once held the writing system together. Regional scribal traditions begin to diverge rapidly, each adapting the script to local usage without a central authority to regulate consistency. Over time, these variations become so pronounced that mutual intelligibility is compromised. What was once a unified system of communication becomes a constellation of related but incompatible writing styles. One of the most striking examples comes from a multi-layered archive discovered in a former administrative hub. Early layers contain highly structured records, with standardized phrasing and consistent seal impressions. Later layers show increasing variation, including partial translations, duplicated entries with altered meanings, and records that appear to reinterpret earlier documents rather than preserve them. In the final layers, administrative clarity dissolves almost completely. Scholars still debate whether this reflects linguistic evolution under stress or deliberate modification of records. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern suggests a breakdown in shared linguistic authority. Another important detail emerges from peripheral settlements. Here, simplified versions of the script persist longer than in central regions. These simplified forms are often used for practical purposes, marking goods, recording transactions, or labeling storage containers. However, they gradually lose grammatical structure, functioning more as symbolic notation than full language. In some cases, these simplified marks evolve into purely decorative motifs. Their original meaning is no longer understood, but their visual presence continues, carried forward by tradition rather than comprehension. This transformation marks a critical threshold when writing stops being a tool of administration and becomes a cultural artifact. In neighbouring civilizations, references to the superpower's language become increasingly inconsistent over time. Early records suggest active translation and diplomatic exchange. Later accounts describe difficulty interpreting documents or rely on intermediaries who may or may not fully understand the original system. Eventually, references shift away from linguistic clarity altogether, treating the script as something archaic, sacred, or symbolic rather than functional. One particularly revealing artifact comes from a coastal trade site where bilingual inscriptions were found. The earlier portion of the inscription is clear and structured, while the corresponding translation becomes increasingly approximate in later sections. It appears that the ability to accurately translate the original language was diminishing, even within contexts that once required precise communication. This loss of linguistic fidelity has profound implications. Without a stable written system, administrative memory becomes fragile. Laws, agreements, and records lose continuity across generations. Even if institutions survive, their ability to maintain consistent knowledge across time is compromised. In several regions, there is evidence that officials began copying older inscriptions without fully understanding their meaning, preserving form but not function. This practice, while preserving the appearance of continuity, likely accelerated the loss of original linguistic coherence. Another lesser-known detail appears in ritual contexts. Certain symbols from the superpower's script continue to appear in ceremonial objects, long after their administrative use disappears. These symbols are often placed without apparent linguistic structure, suggesting that they had transitioned into purely symbolic or spiritual roles. This separation between functional language and symbolic language is significant. It suggests that while the administrative system collapsed, cultural memory persisted in altered form. Meaning was no longer transmitted through comprehension, but through repetition and tradition. As writing becomes fragmented, so too does historical continuity. Later cultures attempting to interpret these inscriptions often project their own meanings onto them, resulting in layered misinterpretations. Over time, the original context becomes increasingly inaccessible, replaced by reinterpretations that reflect the needs or beliefs of later societies. This process transforms the superpower from a historical entity into a semi-mythical one within its own former territory. What survives is not understanding, but traces of structure without access to its original logic. And in that loss of linguistic continuity, the civilization loses one of its most powerful tools of cohesion. Without shared language, even memory itself begins to drift. Long after the administrative systems have fractured and the trade routes have narrowed, the story of the vanished superpower begins to change shape inside human memory itself. It is no longer remembered as a functioning political entity in most later records. Instead, it becomes something harder to define, half history, half inheritance, half warning. Myths begin to occupy the empty spaces left by missing archives, and over time, these myths grow more stable than the facts they replaced. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In early successor cultures, references to the vanished civilization still carry traces of accuracy. There are mentions of former cities, trade routes, and rulers whose names are distorted but still recognizable in structure. But as generations pass, these references shift. The superpower is no longer described as a political system. It becomes a symbolic landscape, an ancestral land of abundance, a place of great kings, or a civilization associated with divine favor and punishment. This transformation is not unusual in itself. Many ancient societies mythologize their predecessors. What is unusual here is the speed and completeness of the shift. Within a relatively short span of time, historical references collapse into narrative archetypes. the superpower becomes associated with exaggerated prosperity, sudden downfall, or divine retribution. These themes are repeated across multiple regions that once shared administrative ties, suggesting a common psychological response to a shared historical rupture. Scholars still debate whether this mythologization reflects cultural amnesia or deliberate reinterpretation. The evidence remains incomplete, but the consistency of motifs suggests that something real was being reshaped rather than purely invented. One of the most important patterns appears in how later cultures reinterpret ruins. Structures originally built for administrative or infrastructural purposes are reclassified in myth as temples, palaces, or sites of supernatural significance. Irrigation channels become described as sacred rivers. Abandoned cities are attributed to gods, giants, or ancient cataclysms beyond human understanding. This reinterpretation often overlays earlier historical understanding rather than replacing it entirely. In some cases, oral traditions preserve fragments of accurate memory embedded within mythic frameworks. A flood may correspond to real environmental change. A curse may reflect disease or resource collapse, but the narrative structure transforms these events into moral or supernatural explanations. Another lesser-known detail emerges from burial practices in successor societies. Some grave goods contain artifacts clearly inherited from the superpower, but their meaning has shifted. Items once used for administrative or economic purposes are placed in ritual contexts, suggesting that their original function was no longer understood. Instead, they were valued for symbolic or ancestral significance. This shift marks a critical turning point in cultural continuity. When objects lose their practical meaning and gain symbolic status, historical knowledge becomes reinterpretation rather than transmission. In some regions, writing itself is preserved only in ritual contexts. Inscriptions appear on ceremonial objects, but the ability to read them is lost. The script becomes sacred but unreadable, functioning as a visual link to an inaccessible past. This phenomenon is observed in multiple post-collapse societies and often signals the final stage of linguistic disconnection. Meanwhile, oral traditions expand. Stories of the vanished superpower grow more elaborate over time, incorporating regional fears, environmental memories, and political narratives of successor states. These stories are not uniform. Each culture reshapes the memory to reflect its own identity, resulting in multiple, sometimes conflicting versions of the same lost civilization. In one tradition, the superpower is remembered as a land of immense order that fell due to pride or imbalance. In another, it is described as a civilization punished by natural forces elsewhere. It becomes a warning about overreach or loss of harmony with the environment. These interpretations vary, but they share a common structure: the idea of a powerful system that exceeded its limits. One particularly intriguing artifact supporting this transformation is a fragmentary inscription found in a transitional cultural layer. It contains what appears to be a partial historical record, followed immediately by symbolic reinterpretation on the same surface. The shift from documentation to myth occurs within a single object, suggesting that the boundary between history and story was already dissolving at the time of its creation. What makes this period especially significant is that myth does not simply replace history, it absorbs it. The infrastructure, the cities, and even the administrative memory of the superpower are recontextualized through narrative frameworks that prioritize meaning over accuracy. This process has a paradoxical effect. While factual understanding diminishes, cultural memory of the civilization becomes more widespread than it was during its actual existence. The superpower survives not as a functioning state, but as an idea distributed across successor societies. And yet, even in myth, something of the original structure remains. The scale, the organization, the sense of a vast coordinated system cannot be fully erased. It persists in exaggerated form, suggesting that memory, even when distorted, still carries echoes of reality. What survives is not history as it was lived, but history as it was reimagined. And in that reimagining, the vanished superpower becomes both more visible and more distant at the same time. Modern excavation does not begin with certainty. It begins with fragments, broken walls emerging from dunes, eroded tablets recovered from collapsed archives, and architectural footprints that only make sense when viewed from above. For centuries, the vanished superpower existed primarily as scattered references in ancient texts. Only with the development of systematic archaeology does it begin to reassemble itself into something recognizable again, though never fully coherent. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The earliest modern excavations were cautious in their conclusions. Initial surveys identified isolated cities, each impressive in its own right but seemingly unrelated. It was only when broader mapping techniques were applied that a larger pattern emerged. These sites were not random. They aligned along ancient river systems, trade corridors, and agricultural zones that together formed a vast interconnected network. What had once appeared as separate discoveries slowly revealed themselves as fragments of a single, expansive system. One of the most important breakthroughs came from comparative analysis of architectural styles. Structures across distant sites shared consistent proportions, construction techniques, and material usage. This uniformity suggested either a highly influential cultural tradition or a centralized administrative system that once regulated building practices across wide regions. At the same time, inconsistencies within this uniformity raised new questions. Certain cities displayed variations in layout that did not match surrounding regions. Some showed hybrid architectural forms combining multiple regional styles. These anomalies suggested that local adaptation coexisted with broader standardization, reinforcing the idea of a complex layered civilization rather than a strictly uniform empire. As excavation techniques improved, attention turned to infrastructure, canals, roadbeds, and storage systems began to map out the true scale of the superpower. Satellite imagery and ground surveys revealed patterns invisible at ground-level geometric planning across entire landscapes, suggesting deliberate coordination over long distances. Yet even with this expanded understanding, one problem persisted. The timeline did not behave cleanly. Different sites produced conflicting dates for similar phases of development. Some regions appeared to peak earlier, others later, and some showed prolonged continuity where neighbouring areas had already declined. This lack of synchronization complicated any attempt to define a single rise and fall narrative. Scholars still debate how to interpret these discrepancies. The evidence remains incomplete, but one leading interpretation is that the superpower was never fully centralized in the way modern analogies suggest. Instead, it may have functioned as a loosely integrated system of regions connected by shared standards rather than strict political control. One of the most revealing discoveries supporting this view comes from administrative seals found across multiple excavation sites. While the seals share common motifs, subtle variations indicate regional autonomy within a shared cultural or administrative framework. This suggests a balance between standardization and local governance that allowed for both cohesion and flexibility. Another major development in modern archaeology was the application of environmental reconstruction. By analyzing pollen, sediment layers, and ancient water systems, researchers began to reconstruct the landscapes in which the superpower operated. These reconstructions revealed a dynamic environment shaped by both natural variation and extensive human modification. What emerged was not a static civilization, but one constantly adapting to shifting environmental conditions. Agricultural systems expanded and contracted in response to water availability. Settlements shifted gradually along river systems. Entire regions appear to have been periodically reorganized, suggesting a high degree of responsiveness to ecological change. However, this adaptability had limits. In several key regions, environmental stress appears to have outpaced the civilization's ability to adjust. These zones correspond closely with areas showing signs of earlier decline in administrative and trade systems. The overlap suggests that environmental and institutional pressures were deeply intertwined in the final phases of the superpower's existence. One lesser-known detail comes from excavations of peripheral settlements that were long considered marginal. These sites, once thought to be insignificant, now appear crucial to understanding the broader system. They show evidence of sustained occupation even after central regions declined, indicating that the superpower's legacy persisted unevenly across its former territory. In some cases, these peripheral sites preserve older traditions more faithfully than central cities, suggesting that cultural continuity may have survived longer at the edges than at the core. As the scale of discovery expands, so does the complexity of interpretation. Each new excavation adds detail but also introduces contradictions. Some findings suggest rapid transformation, others suggest gradual evolution. Some point towards centralized coordination, others imply decentralized networks. Rather than resolving these contradictions, modern archaeology often amplifies them. What becomes clear is that the superpower cannot be understood through a single lens. It is not a simple empire with a clear beginning and end, but a layered system that evolved unevenly across geography and time. And as modern tools continue to reveal more of its structure, the paradox deepens. The more we uncover, the less singular the story becomes. The superpower is not reappearing as a simple historical entity. It is reappearing as a fragmented architecture of human complexity, vast, inconsistent, and still partially hidden beneath the land. The further modern research advances, the more the vanished superpower resists a single explanation. Each layer of evidence that once seemed to point toward a unified collapse now branches into competing interpretations. Archaeology, climate science, anthropology, and historical linguistics all converge on the same landscape, yet none of them fully agree on what that landscape once represented. What emerges instead is a field of tension between theories, each explaining part of the picture while failing to account for the whole. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, one of the dominant interpretations remains environmental stress. In this view, gradual shifts in climate, water availability, and soil productivity placed increasing pressure on agricultural systems that were already highly optimized but vulnerable to instability. This would explain the uneven decline across regions, the fragmentation of trade, and the gradual abandonment of infrastructure. Yet even this explanation struggles to account for the sophistication and resilience seen in certain areas during the same periods of supposed decline. Another major interpretation focuses on internal fragmentation. According to this model, the superpower did not collapse under external pressure alone, but unraveled from within as administrative cohesion weakened. Regional centers gained autonomy, competing authorities emerged, and shared systems of governance gradually dissolved. This would explain the loss of standardization in writing, seals, and trade practices. However, it does not fully explain the environmental signatures of stress that appear independently across multiple regions. A third perspective emphasizes migration and external pressure. Population movements from surrounding regions may have introduced instability, either through conflict, cultural integration, or resource competition. This model aligns with evidence of shifting burial practices and changing material culture. But again, it does not fully account for the long-term infrastructural continuity seen in some areas long after political structures appear to have weakened. Scholars still debate whether these are competing explanations or overlapping processes. The evidence remains incomplete, but increasing consensus suggests that no single factor is sufficient. Instead, multiple stresses likely interacted over time, reinforcing each other in complex feedback loops. One of the most important insights from recent interdisciplinary studies is the concept of cascading instability. In this framework, environmental fluctuations weaken agricultural output, which reduces administrative capacity, which in turn weakens infrastructure maintenance, which further reduces environmental resilience. Each system reinforces the failure of the others, creating a gradual downward spiral that does not require a single catastrophic event. This model aligns closely with the archaeological record, where signs of decline appear unevenly and asynchronously across different regions. Another important line of evidence comes from technological continuity. Despite widespread signs of fragmentation, certain engineering practices persist across the transition period. Irrigation systems, architectural methods, and material production techniques do not disappear abruptly. Instead, they degrade slowly, adapting to local conditions rather than vanishing entirely. This suggests that knowledge was not lost in a single moment, but gradually decoupled from centralized systems of transmission. In some regions, this decoupling leads to innovation at a local level. Communities adapt older technologies to new conditions, creating hybrid systems that differ significantly from earlier standardized forms. In others, technological decline is more pronounced, with simpler methods replacing more complex ones. This uneven technological trajectory complicates any narrative of total collapse. It suggests transformation rather than extinction. A lesser-known but increasingly important discovery comes from DNA analysis of human remains across multiple sites. Genetic continuity in many regions indicates that populations did not disappear, but rather shifted, mixed, and reorganized. This supports the idea that the superpower's population survived through transformation into successor cultures rather than complete replacement. At the same time, shifts in isotopic signatures show increased mobility during the transitional period, reinforcing the idea of widespread migration and resettlement. Another revealing detail emerges from ceremonial contexts. Ritual objects from later periods often incorporate elements derived from earlier administrative artifacts. Seals, symbols, and inscriptions are repurposed in religious or symbolic ways, suggesting that political memory was transformed into cultural memory. Authority becomes abstracted, embedded in tradition rather than governance. This transformation is significant. It indicates that while the superpower as a political entity dissolved, its symbolic framework continued to influence successor societies. One of the most intriguing contradictions in the record is the simultaneous presence of continuity and rupture. Infrastructure persists, but administration weakens. Populations remain, but systems of coordination dissolve. Technologies survive, but their standardization fades. These overlapping patterns resist simple classification. What emerges is not a clean transition from civilization to collapse, but a layered process of reorganization across multiple domains of human activity. In this sense, the superpower does not end, it disperses. And as it disperses, its identity becomes increasingly difficult to isolate within any single explanatory framework. The competing theories do not cancel each other out. Instead, they overlap in ways that reflect the complexity of the system itself. What remains is a civilization that cannot be fully captured by any one model of rise or fall. In the deeper layers of interpretation, beyond excavation and analysis, the vanished superpower begins to take on a different kind of presence. It is no longer only a subject of archaeological inquiry or historical reconstruction. It becomes a trace embedded within surviving cultures, a set of echoes carried forward in language, infrastructure, and inherited behavior patterns that outlived the political structure that once generated them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most persistent signs of survival appears in cultural continuity. Across multiple successor societies, researchers identify shared architectural principles that seem to descend from earlier standardized systems. Even when building materials and styles change, certain spatial logics remain consistent: the placement of storage areas relative to living spaces, the orientation of administrative courtyards, and the recurring use of modular construction techniques that suggest inherited knowledge rather than independent invention. These patterns do not prove direct institutional continuity, but they strongly suggest that foundational design principles persisted long after centralized coordination disappeared. In linguistic traditions, similar echoes appear. While the original writing system fragments and disappears in most regions, certain structural elements survive within later languages. These may include grammatical patterns, borrowed administrative terminology, or symbolic concepts that carry traces of earlier meanings even when their original context is lost. In some cases, entire words survive with altered definitions, preserving linguistic fossils of a long-gone administrative world. What survives is not the system itself, but its residue within successor communication frameworks. Another layer of continuity is visible in social organization. Certain regions maintain hierarchical structures that resemble earlier administrative frameworks, even when no direct institutional link can be traced. Local governance systems often mirror older patterns of delegation and regional coordination, suggesting that organizational habits persisted culturally even after political unity dissolved. Scholars still debate whether this reflects conscious inheritance or structural necessity. The evidence remains incomplete, but the recurrence of similar organizational forms across distant regions suggests that the superpower's administrative logic may have been deeply embedded in the societies it once governed. At the same time, there are clear signs of transformation rather than simple preservation. Many successor cultures adapt inherited systems to new environmental and political realities. Irrigation practices, for example, continue in modified forms but with reduced scale and complexity. Trade networks re-emerge, but they are localized and less standardized. Even ritual practices evolve, blending older symbolic elements with new ideological frameworks. This process creates a hybrid cultural landscape where continuity and change are inseparable. One particularly revealing category of evidence comes from what archaeologists refer to as secondary reuse layers. These are contexts where materials from the superpower's infrastructure are repurposed in later constructions. Stones from administrative buildings are used in new settlements, seal impressions are incorporated into decorative or ritual objects. Even fragments of writing appear embedded in unrelated architectural contexts. This reuse indicates both practical adaptation and symbolic inheritance. The physical remnants of the superpower were not discarded, they were integrated into new cultural systems, often stripped of their original administrative meaning, but preserved as material heritage. In some regions, this integration becomes so extensive that it blurs the boundary between the original civilization and its successors. Determining where one ends and the other begins becomes increasingly difficult, as cultural elements flow continuously across time without clear rupture. Another important insight comes from the study of memory landscapes. Certain geographic locations repeatedly appear in later traditions as sacred, ancestral, or historically significant, even when archaeological evidence suggests multiple phases of occupation and reinterpretation. These places often correspond to earlier administrative or infrastructural centres of the superpower, suggesting that memory attached itself to physical geography, even as political identity dissolved. These memory sites act as anchors for fragmented historical consciousness, preserving continuity through spatial rather than institutional means. Genetic studies add another dimension to this continuity. Population analysis indicates that many modern groups in regions once controlled by the superpower share significant genetic continuity with ancient populations from the same areas. This suggests that the disappearance of the civilization was not accompanied by large-scale population replacement, but rather by cultural and administrative transformation. In other words, the people remained, even as the system they once belonged to changed beyond recognition. One of the more subtle but important findings involves economic behaviour. Certain patterns of resource distribution, settlement spacing, and agricultural organisation persist across centuries in modified forms. These patterns appear too consistent to be purely coincidental, suggesting that economic logic inherited from the superpower continued to influence decision-making long after formal systems collapsed. What emerges from all these strands is a complex picture of survival through transformation. The superpower does not end in a way that erases its influence. Instead, it dissolves into successor systems that carry forward its structural DNA in altered forms. This creates a paradox at the heart of historical reconstruction. The civilization appears to vanish as a unified entity, yet its influence persists everywhere in fragmented, indirect, and often unrecognizable ways. It is present in architecture without identity, in language without origin, in governance without continuity. And so the question shifts once again not to where the superpower went, but to how much of it still exists beneath the surface of later worlds, and the answer is not disappearance, or it is diffusion. At the edge of the desert excavation zone, where wind slowly reclaims every exposed surface, a final pattern begins to emerge, one that does not belong to any single site. Culture, or period, is not a structure, not a language, not even a direct historical trace. It is the accumulation of absence itself, the way entire systems vanish unevenly, leaving behind fragments that still behave as if the system were once complete. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Modern researchers, after decades of excavation and analysis, begin to recognize that the greatest difficulty in understanding this ancient superpower is not a lack of evidence, but an excess of disconnected evidence. Every discovery adds clarity to one region while increasing uncertainty in another. A canal system explains agricultural success in one basin, but contradicts timelines in another. A writing fragment clarifies administrative structure in one era, while showing complete disjunction in a neighbouring site. The civilization refuses to resolve into a single coherent narrative because it was never static long enough to be captured that way. Instead, it behaves like a system in motion across instability. One of the most important realizations in recent scholarship is that the concept of disappearance itself may be misleading. The superpower did not vanish in a single collapse, nor was it erased by a singular catastrophic event. It dissolved through uneven processes that unfolded across centuries, shaped by environmental stress, administrative fragmentation, migration, and cultural transformation happening simultaneously, but not uniformly. Some regions adapted and evolved into successor societies. Others declined and were absorbed. Others still retained fragments of older systems long after central coordination had ceased. What survives is not a remnant empire, but a distributed inheritance scattered across geography and time. This explains why historical memory struggles to define it. It was never fully present in one form at one time long enough to be preserved as a single story. Even the idea of a superpower becomes, in hindsight, a reconstruction imposed by modern interpretation. The scale of its influence is undeniable, but its internal structure appears more fluid than rigid, more networked than centralized. Power, in this context, may have been less about uniform control and more about shared systems that could hold together under stable conditions but fragment under pressure. And when pressure came from climate shifts, migration, internal decentralization, and economic contraction, those shared systems began to separate, not all at once, not everywhere equally, but enough to prevent reintegration. The final stage of this long process is not collapse in the dramatic sense, but disassembly. Institutions break into regional forms, languages diverge, trade contracts into local circuits, infrastructure persists but loses coherence, memory shifts from documentation to myth, and eventually, the original identity dissolves into successor cultures that no longer recognize themselves as part of a single inherited system. What remains in the present is a landscape layered with echoes, roads that no longer connect to the networks that built them, irrigation systems maintained by communities unaware of their original design logic, symbols reused without understanding, and ruins that appear isolated but once belonged to something far larger. The ancient superpower is therefore not lost in the way vanished things are often imagined. It is scattered. It survives as fragments of coordination without coordination, structure without centrality, and memory without continuity. And perhaps the most striking realization is this: civilizations do not always end where they fail. Sometimes they continue long after, transformed into something unrecognizable, still shaping landscapes and societies that no longer know their origin. As the wind moves across the ruins and the desert slowly covers what remains, the silence is not empty. It is layered with everything that once connected these places into a single functioning world. A world that history did not erase in a moment, but slowly forgot how to see as one. And in that forgetting, an empire did not simply disappear. It became the ground beneath everything that followed. The desert keeps it now, not as a story, but as fragments waiting for each generation to piece together again what was never truly gone, only scattered across time,